It is the case that Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, says that an extremely limited application of abatement technologies will be required in the future for hard-to-abate sectors like cement, for instance. Whereas leaders like Kerry are often talking about CCS in relation to the energy sector, and the IPCC scenarios make it very clear that applications in the energy sector for CCS are extremely limited and by no means can be used to justify ongoing fossil fuel production and expansion. So let's be really clear about what the application of CCS is. An existing CCS technologies are primarily used for enhanced oil recovery. So 79% of existing CCS projects are actually just about extracting more oil and gas. So they're not operating in that very targeted way that the scientists allow for in future scenarios. So yeah, we've got this kind of fight going on at COP28 about the fossil fuel phase out and the inclusion of abatement language within that call from parties for a global agreement to invest in and accelerate the energy transition. There are some parties who are inserting this language of unabated fossil fuels in order to use it as an escape hatch for continuing business as usual. So largely these are countries that have major fossil fuel interests, that are major fossil fuel producers and exporters, that are kind of looking to insert ambiguity into the language so that they might continue their expansion and production of fossil fuels. And let's remember that the United States has the largest expansion plans of any country when it comes to fossil fuel production in the next number of years. Some countries, however, are using this language and putting guardrails around it. So the EU, for instance, Canada, they have introduced this language of unabated, and they've said, but when we're going to use this, we're going to specify that it is in line with the science that we've heard from the IPCC. So we're only going to be using it in a very limited application in those hard-to-abate sectors. And then yet more countries are saying, we're not going to include this word at all because we understand that it is one of those ways in which the fossil fuel industry and politicians in their pocket are looking to leave the door open for ongoing fossil fuel expansion. And those high-ambition countries are also some of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. And so I see a real connection there between those countries that have come to COP28 who are pushing for the loss and damage fund, which we got adopted in the first day of this COP, saying more fossil fuels equals more loss and damage. And so leaving the door open in any way to ongoing fossil fuel expansion is not something we're going to accept. So I think that this COP is likely to deliver a historic agreement on addressing the cause of the climate crisis. It's hard to believe that just 2 years ago was the first time that the UN climate talks named any fossil fuel, in that case coal. Last year, 80 countries were lobbying to expand that to include oil and gas, but were defeated by a handful of blockers. And this year, 106 countries organized themselves coming into COP28 saying, we're going to push for this to be the COP that finally says we need to get rid of fossil fuels. Some of those countries are using this word unabated, and they're looking to put guardrails around it, but they're still going to fight for that fossil fuel phase-out outcome. And the blockers are the ones who are really trying to insert some escape hatches so that they can just continue expanding fossil fuels. But I think ultimately the signal that we're hoping to get out of this COP is one that will be sent to investment markets and policymakers around the world, that it's time to start planning the just transition away from fossil fuel production and use. And that's the role of this space, is to provide that kind of global signal, whereas it's the role of governments to implement the policies on the ground.